Hi, listeners. Thank you once again for joining for another episode from the Lessons from the Playroom podcast. I am really excited isn't even the word. It's more of like a gratitude feeling beyond sort of excitement. Um, we're going way back to the beginning. My special guest was one of the very first guests that I ever had on this podcast to talk about a topic that, well, frankly, just isn't talked about enough in the world of play therapy. We're going to be talking about FASD, which is fetal alcohol um, syndrome disorder. Did I get it right?
um, Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders.
Spectrum, thank you. Spectrum, thank you. See, even there, right? My own catching up here. Um, and we had an episode way back in the beginning, and I have asked our special guest here to come back for a part two. So I have Natascha Lawrence with me. I'm going to introduce you to Natascha, everyone, and then I want to share a little bit of a story about when Natascha and I first sat down to record the first one. So first of all, Natascha, thank you so much for coming back and offering education and catching us all up on what we all really need to understand about FASD.
Thank you.
Yes. So, listeners, Natascha Lawrence, she's a registered clinical counselor supervisor. She's a BC registered play therapist. That's British Columbia, everyone. Certified Synergetic Play Therapy Supervisor and EMDR Practitioner. She specializes in neurodiversity, particularly FASD. She is a BIPOC first generation Canadian settler of mixed Asian ancestry, an ADHDer, queer, and has a mobility disability due to a chronic pain neurological condition. She's also the founder of the FASD Institute, which listeners, we're going to talk about that today also. And most importantly, is the parent of two incredible neurodivergent children, one who has FASD. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Natascha.
Thank you.
Mhm. So I remember that you and I were at the University of British Columbia, right there in downtown Vancouver, and we were having a discussion about FASD, and I asked if you would please be a guest on the podcast. And what I remember is that we found a hallway and we sat
Yeah.
down in the middle of a hallway in the middle of the university to record this podcast. I think we probably just were we recording through my headphones? Like how did we
Yes.
even do
Yeah.
it?
To your computer, just a little mic.
The little mic there.
Yeah.
I
And
remember
we had to
people.
pause when people walked by.
Yeah, exactly. Students were walking by. I mean, way back at the beginning of this podcast, but I really wanted you to come back and talk because I know that understanding of how to work with FASD has been updated.
Mhm.
And as I mentioned, Natascha, when I think about all the play therapy conferences that I've been to in my play therapy career, I'm going to be hard pressed to think of one that had FASD presented on the stage as a topic,
Yeah.
which is super sad to say.
hmm
So, share with us a little bit about why this topic is important to you, and then let's just jump into a quick refresher, and then we'll go from there.
When I teach about FASD, I say that this is not just me talking about facts, and it is, right? We're going to talk about facts, things that we know from clinical experience, that we know from research. This is hard work for me.
Mhm.
My daughter is 20 years old, and I talk about her, and I have permission to share about her when I teach. And I want to make sure that every child, every youth, every person with FASD is actually able to see a play therapist, to see a counselor, and be treated with respect, without stigma, without a judgment or stereotyping, that they don't have barriers. Like, why is this so important? Like, really, like, it's hard work, it's about my child, but it's also, I literally just heard of a potential client who said a play therapist they reached out to said that I don't accept FASD clients or clients who have FASD because there's no learning that can happen. So there's no point. And that's still the stigma within some places of play therapy, within mental health, just generally.
Yeah.
That's so much harm that can be happening.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, that just, my heart just sunk.
Mhm.
I just heard you say that.
Yeah.
So let's just go ahead and name that
Mhm.
for listeners. It's just
Mhm.
not true.
Yes.
Like, just for those of you that are going to listen to this whole episode, let's just start there. It's just
Yeah.
not true. There's
Yeah.
so much support that can
Mhm.
that can happen, and there's so much healing that can happen.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah. And learning can, everyone can learn.
yeah,
We just have to learn the way that people with FASD learn.
yeah,
Yeah.
which I can't wait to get into here
Mhm.
a bit more. So let's do just a little refresher.
Mhm.
So give us a quick little overview of
Mhm.
ASD, and then
Mhm.
we'll bring it into the world of play therapy.
And so I'm mindful that when I'm using terminology, right,
Mhm.
I'm talking within a Canadian context. I'll also uh, talk about the US, but it's different across the world because I know there's listeners from around the world. I wish we had all adopted the way that FASD is talked about in Australia, where they call it FASD, which just sounds so much nicer, right?
Mhm.
Right? It rolls off the tongue so much easier.
Mhm.
So everywhere else other than Canada, FASD is an umbrella term,
Mhm.
right? Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders. In Canada, they were like, this is way too confusing. People couldn't remember all the different diagnoses, like fetal alcohol syndrome, which most people kind of are familiar with.
Yeah.
But like, to simplify, we're like, let's just talk about FASD. Right?
Mhm.
And so in Canada, it is a diagnosis. And you'll notice that there's different definitions out there online,
Mhm.
also different for each country.
Mhm.
And I found that when I was working with clients, I needed to find a way of describing it that worked for kids, one,
Mhm.
uh, but then was affirming and also helped to describe it in a way, thinking about the way we would talk about things from a play therapy perspective. I also do parts work. And so I found the best way for me to talk about it with my clients. And so this is how I teach it now is FASD is a whole body diagnosis.
Mhm.
And that's a shift. Some people might have heard things like talking about the brain. And though those are true, it actually doesn't cover everything. So it's a whole body diagnosis
Mhm.
associated with neurodiversity
Mhm.
and various disabilities.
Mhm.
You'll hear people talk about that FASD is a disability, which is not untrue.
Mhm.
But again, it didn't help my clients kind of understand all the different parts and all the different pieces that their diagnosis meant or did not mean.
Mhm. Mhm. There's something very honoring of
Mhm,
the way you just described it, even just the language, whole body.
mhm,
Um, yeah, there's something, yeah, very honoring
mhm.
about encompassing someone's experience in a
Yeah.
much larger way.
Mhm,
I'm curious. So with that, um, how do we as play therapists begin to orient towards helping a client?
mhm,
And I know we're also probably going to get into the family also, because that just seems like that'd be a really important component of the work
mhm,
here.
mhm.
Stigma also for the caregivers. How do we even begin to orient?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I think about what does a play therapist need to know, right? Stepping into a session, right? Or you get a referral. First thing is that, what we would do if we're working with any special population, cultural safety. So
Mhm,
you do need to learn about FASD, right? There's
mhm,
wonderful free programs out
mhm,
there that are accessible online. So they're
mhm,
accessible from anywhere. And um, I can, you can always email me and I can talk to you about them, which ones I like and which ones are maybe easier to navigate.
mhm,
And when I talk about working through like an FASD lens, it's a lens that you don't have to suddenly shift to work with different clients.
mhm,
The beautiful thing is that it's like it works for every child. So I love
mhm,
play therapy. Play therapy is one of those lenses
mhm.
that works because it doesn't require language.
Right.
And being working through an FASD lens is working without needing language because it's a language-based disability.
Mhm,
Um, in order to get the diagnosis, there's always a receptive language disability,
mhm,
but there's also an expressive language disability that gets masked and confused because often individuals with FASD are really great talkers,
mhm,
but they repeat themselves. It's very rote. It is off topic, and that can be confusing because it's like, well, that's not actually a disability there. They're just choosing to change the topic and not stay on point.
mhm,
And or they can answer my questions so that I did have full understanding of what was happening there. But with play therapy, all of that, you don't
mhm,
have to worry about any of that.
mhm,
So working through an FASD lens, it works for everybody because we know
mhm,
play therapy works for every child.
mhm,
It's really important if you're neurodivergent, right?
mhm,
And FASD is associated with neurodiversity. There can be co-occurring. It can also be, there's a lot of misdiagnosis, but um, a lot of the like communication preferences, sensory preferences,
mhm,
FASD, individuals with FASD have equal, if not greater sensory needs than like autistic children.
mhm,
Right. And you notice with autistic children, I use identities centered
mhm,
language. The language preferences for FASD are um, person person centered.
mhm,
Uh, but it's critical for kids with FASD.
mhm, mhm,
Um, and I've had so many clients that I've worked with, like coming back to that story where, they've had something really bad happen.
mhm,
Maybe there's been abuse.
mhm,
And it was literally, oh, you have FASD. Well, I'm going to put you in anger management classes.
mhm.
But if you just saw them as a kid, you would go, no, they need play therapy.
Right. They work through their trauma,
Yeah, yeah,
just like every other kid.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. You're highlighting something that I think might be a unique thought for a
Mhm,
lot of play therapists,
mhm.
particularly play therapists that don't um, tend to think about their play space as how do I make my play space neurodivergent friendly?
Yes,
And I
yeah.
and I just heard you say that actually with FASD
Mhm.
children it's even more important.
Yes, yes.
So can we talk about that for a second?
Mhm,
What, in addition to just our
mhm,
play therapy, the skills that we're bringing to the
mhm.
table, it sounds like the space itself is actually really important.
Yes.
There are some really important things in the
Mhm,
space
mhm,
to support what's happening for someone that has that level of sensory
mhm.
challenge. Will you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. And the same kind of idea that I said, this will be good for all kids.
Exactly. Everybody, turn your playrooms into playrooms that are sensory
Yes.
based playrooms.
Yes. Because we just know with trauma, right? It can affect our sensory processing.
Exactly.
So this is great for all kids. And then
Exactly.
it's critical for kids with FASD.
Yeah.
So particularly because interoception, I know Lisa, you talk a lot about interoception. It can be so greatly affected
Yeah.
that even that awareness or that I have sensory preferences or needs.
Yeah.
I really see a lot of my kiddos, even my own daughter, that the behavior, I'm doing the air quotes, the behaviors were all sensory related, but no one picked up on the fact because the child wasn't talking about sensory preferences,
Uh-huh.
right? They just saw the kid who refused to go in a music class punching the EA,
Mhm.
but that was because I didn't want to go into the loud space.
Mhm.
So in your, you have to think outside your playroom first, like your waiting room.
Mhm.
Um, and kind of the easiest way, because I know for a lot of people who aren't maybe as familiar with like neurodiversity affirming or sensory systems, learn about it. So helpful and part of your
Yes.
practice.
Learn about it, learn about it. We've got
Yes.
episodes on
Yes.
go listen to the
Yes.
Interoception podcast and the
Yes.
sensory any title of an episode that has the word sensory in it. Please
Yes.
go listen to the episode.
Yes.
Yes.
And I learned all of this from like OTs when I first started
Yeah.
doing the work. And
Yeah.
it was so yes, it just created such a great guide
Mhm.
for my play therapy practice,
Mhm.
is that you create options,
Mhm.
ways to turn things on and off, dimmers,
Mhm.
different sensory items in the playroom. I have the rebounder, right? The
Mhm.
mini trampoline, a tent. I have the bot bag, but I also have crash mats.
Mhm.
Um, Everything is covered,
Mhm.
right? And actually, that was something I learned from Marie Jose.
Mhm.
And and if you're not familiar with her, like Lisa could talk a lot
Go
about
listen to the podcast.
yes, yes. Was that so that kids can take their time to discover and not be overwhelmed as soon as they walk in? Because play therapists, we might have difficulty with how many toys we like to have
Yes.
in our spaces.
Yes.
We like toys. We
Yeah.
like
Well,
to bring them in. Yeah.
I think what you're saying right there, if I can just even highlight this, it's why I recorded the episode that
Mhm.
says, "What does your playroom say about you?" Because I
Yeah.
think oftentimes play therapists create their playrooms aesthetically in a way
Yes.
that's pleasing to them as the play therapist. Like, oh, I love my room. My room
Mhm.
looks great. It
Yeah.
feels great to my sensory system. And
Yes.
yes, that's important,
Mhm.
but that are we also creating a win-win here where something that works in my system but also can work with other systems, or is my playroom me focused, not we
Mhm.
focused? And
Yes.
I don't hear that talked about enough, so thank you for highlighting that with FASD kids the playroom needs to be we focused,
Mhm.
not me focused.
Mhm.
And yeah, how many different options, sensory
Yeah.
options can you put in there? I remember with Robert Jason Grant, he
Mhm.
talks a lot about, yeah, the beloved sand tray in the
Yes.
playroom for
Yes.
most, and for a lot of children, that's just no, right? The
Yep.
sensory experience, no. And I love how he talks about having trays as example
Mhm.
of different textures in
Yes.
different trays, which again, back to different options,
Yeah.
different ways of approaching something that is considered a standard item in a play space.
Yeah.
How do we make a standard item more sensory friendly?
But I think we take the word standard out,
Yeah.
right? I've heard things like standard or what's normal. One,
Yeah.
this is from a client and I have permission to use this. And I said to them, this is the most brilliant statement. I'm going to use this forever.
Mhm.
Normal is just a setting on a washing machine, right? Why do we need any kid,
Uh-huh.
regardless of anything, to be quote unquote normal or fit into a box?
Yeah.
We often say that kids with FASD, it's beyond just the square pegs going into a round hole. They're like, I'm a multidimensional shape with points and
Mhm.
colors that spins, and
Mhm.
now you're trying to put me in a round hole.
Mhm.
So don't worry about having this standard or this normal, have options. And that part of offering options and letting kids actually, because kids often never get taught
Mhm.
or given permission that they can have preferences, that they
Mhm.
can have needs, that they have autonomy or choice in
Mhm.
what the things that they do, particularly once there's disability or neurodiversity
Mhm.
involved, right?
Mhm.
Choice and autonomy are stripped away, right?
Mhm.
And things become much more prescriptive.
Mhm.
So I have multiple, like the plastic trays. Like I have my pretty wood, sealed tray that, I like aesthetically.
Mhm.
And then I have like 5 plastic totes that I can do rice in, kinetic sand, that I have a certain amount of sand I allocate for messy sensory play
Yeah.
with paint or
Yeah.
water. And so, and just offering those choices. Do you like the lights brighter, dimmer? You can play with the dimmer. Oh, play with it. I've had clients where our play was sitting in the dark for 30 minutes,
Mhm.
passing a fidget back and forth. There
Yeah.
were no words.
Yeah.
And it was just seeing a complete shift in that child,
Yeah.
just seeing what it was like for them to not have any demands, not have anything put on them. And they were just, it was like they woke up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can even feel it as you describe it,
Mhm.
just, yeah, to calm down the sensory
Mhm.
overload so
Mhm.
they can find themselves for a moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the reason why we start first with sensory systems, I'm so glad you asked me about that about the room, because it's something, again, it works for everybody.
Hmm.
So it's something you get to have and offer for every single kiddo who's walking in your door, or youth or adult. I do play therapy
Yeah.
with children, youth, and adults.
Yeah.
Is that if you think about, because people will ask me about all these different presenting issues that individuals with FASD, right? The clients they get, like why they're being referred.
Hmm.
And they can be really big things, really scary things. And they'll want to shift their work
Hmm.
because it's someone who has FASD. Right? I
Hmm.
got to teach this kid
Hmm.
skills.
Hmm.
But would we do that for any other kiddo in play therapy?
Hmm.
No, we would just want to meet that kid where they're at.
Hmm.
And all those presenting issues, all those things, like, because there's all these labels kids with FASD get,
Hmm.
okay, that they're aggressive, that they can't learn, that they're violent, that there's these, because the statistics out there, right? The information online is so stigmatizing, so stereotyping. A lot of it is old.
Hmm.
A lot of the stats, the methodology isn't great.
Hmm.
It's also, we had to use that information just to try and go, hey, we need supports, recognize, this is the conversations that the autism community was having 30 years ago,
Hmm.
right? 40 years ago, and we're still having that fight. The Lancet just had an article literally, I think a month or two ago, about why we need to get rid of the FASD diagnosis,
Mm. Interesting.
right? And if you don't know who the Lancet is, it's like our top medical paper.
Interesting. Mm.
So there's still that debate
Hmm.
there.
Hmm.
And so with the kiddos coming in, it's because no one in their life is looking at them through an FASD lens. They're
Yeah.
not looking whole body. It is complex. That's why I said you have to learn more information. And
Yeah.
and I'm not the one who came up with the fact that it's a whole body diagnosis.
Natasha, I have
Yeah.
a question if you can weave
Yeah.
in. You have a terminology where you call it the
Mhm.
FASD iceberg.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
this part of it?
Yes.
Will
Yes.
you will you put an
Yeah.
FASD iceberg
Mhm.
framework together for
Yeah.
us? Yeah.
So if you think about like an iceberg, and we've had the iceberg analogy in like lots of different mental
Yeah.
health and play therapy things, and I borrowed it because it for me was the easiest way to think about is most people just stick to the surface, right?
Hmm.
We even know that, like, and that was so refreshing for me with synergetic play therapy is, right, everything is an attempt to regulate.
Hmm.
You need to go deeper. What is the child actually trying to regulate? Behavior is not just communication, it's the nervous system crying out to try and take care of itself.
Hmm.
And because FESD is a whole body diagnosis, and so that was that was actually figured out by adults who have FESD at a conference.
Interesting. Hmm.
We were sitting at a table together, And this is the Adult Leadership Committee. And so you can follow them on social media. And they've talked about this. And it's people like Miles Hemmelreich and CJ Lucky and Emily Hargrave. And I want to give credit to them. Where they were, and these are all adults who are doing well, right? They are now working in the field, teaching doctors and other professionals about FASD. And they're like, my doctor just diagnosed me with this. My doctor just diagnosed me with this, and so on and so forth. And they're like, wait a minute, could this be because of FASD? And they've studied this, and this has been replicated. They've called this the lay of the land. They've actually done a part 2. And it's something like 3,000 medical conditions.
Wow.
That are more common in FASD. And when I say more common, like some of them are 20 to 100 times more common.
Wow.
And when they were listing off these things, I could tick off every single one for my dog.
So are you describing almost like there's this sort of presenting symptom,
Yeah.
which, let's be honest, are the ones that society judges and labels?
Yes.
Just go ahead and name that.
Yeah.
Very misunderstood.
Mhm.
But underneath it, so many different challenges, medical
Yeah.
issues,
Sensory
sensory
processing,
processing, disabilities,
communication
like
needs.
just
Yes.
all of the, and just so much underneath maybe one gesture of I lash out.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I think about, I get called into schools, I get a referral, aggression in school, right? And people who have had kiddos on their caseload who have FASD, like that would be a very common thing. And if I can tell a story why this is so, again, near and dear to my heart.
Yeah.
So my daughter, when she was, and we were very lucky, we had services from birth, which is very rare. She didn't get it because of FASD, it was because of other things. She got diagnosed at 2, again, very, very rare. Most diagnoses can't even happen. Most referrals for a diagnosis can't even happen until a child is reading and writing, because you have to go do a full psych ed.
Interesting.
So most kids are getting diagnosed at 10, 12.
Okay, I just have to pause and take a breath on that with
Yeah.
with what I understand about right the brain and the
Yeah.
development of the
Yeah.
nervous
Yeah.
system. I'm like, whoa, no, the time for intervention
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
right at the very beginning,
Yep.
where there's that
Yeah.
critical window to be able to do some deep
Yes.
repair and repatterning in the system.
Yep.
I just had to take a breath on that.
Yeah. Right.
Mm, mm,
And there's so many reasons for that.
mhm,
So they're suspected,
mhm,
and you can work through that FASD lens. It's going to be beneficial.
mhm,
And so my daughter's very, very first meeting in kindergarten
mhm.
was because she spat in the EA's mouth.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And so anybody who is a parent, any play therapist knows how that meeting could go.
Yeah, right.
And before that, we were having, right, even though we knew about FASD, I was learning about it. Um, I didn't have that affirming lens yet.
Yeah.
Right? The principal, rather than it being, because it was a meeting with everybody, the whole school-based team,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
Rather than that principal being like, what does my daughter have to do differently? What do we have to do? Because that's usually what parents get, right? They get the shame and the blame. This is something you need to fix at home.
Yeah.
You need to have a talk with them. That's disrespectful. It's also kindergartner, but I've heard these conversations for kindergarten.
Yep. Yep.
Um, our principal went, what do we need to know? Because this is in their, it probably was in their first kid with FASD.
Mhm,
We estimate 4 to 5% of the general population has FASD.
mhm,
That's double the amount of autism.
mhm,
But for them, they didn't know about it. They didn't have that training. They went, what do we need to learn?
mm.
And they trained every single member of the school, not
Wow.
just the kindergarten teacher, not just the EA, for
Wow.
a week.
Wow.
And they had a full day training. They brought in our specialist and was there for a week doing observation. My daughter never had a single incident of aggression again in school. Not
Wow.
one. The
Wow.
rest of her entire school career
Wow.
because everybody was able to go, what do we need
Uh-huh.
to support and look through an FASD? What are the things all below the iceberg?
Wow. That's so huge.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so with as a play therapist, and you get the referral, you talk to the parents, you get a report from school, being with the child, just doing play therapy, just meeting them where they're at, you really get to see what is all below the surface.
Mm-hmm.
What really is their sensory needs? What really is their communication needs? What's their processing needs?
Mm-hmm.
What
Mm-hmm.
is just their like capacity for like and because whole body, right? It's we say FASD is a chronic pain condition, it's a chronic inflammatory condition.
Mm-hmm.
Are you noticing how tired they are? Are you noticing toileting things that no one's kind of talking about because they're 8 or 10 years old? Are
Mm-hmm.
you seeing developmental things?
Mm-hmm.
So, and then you get to help frame it. Because that's what we do as play therapists. We see this and then we help reframe that for parents,
Mm-hmm.
for
Yeah.
schools in an affirming way
Yeah.
versus changing the kid,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I have two questions. One I'll get to in a minute because I want to talk about working with parents. Um, but I imagine, and I'm just saying this so we can normalize this for play therapists. We're not talking short-term therapy
No.
here, and so I'm hearing layers.
Yes.
I'm hearing layers. I'm hearing process.
Hmm.
I'm hearing settle in for a
Yes.
relationship.
Yes.
Mhm. Right? A
Yes.
relationship that builds over time, that
Yeah.
ebbs and flows over
Yeah.
time. Yes? Is that,
Yes.
yeah.
And this was a shift for me in my work too.
Mhm.
When I started, as a mental health clinician, even as a play therapist, this felt like there's this shame or stigma around long-term therapy. Like it
Right,
was
right,
somehow a bad thing. It was a reflection on me as a therapist,
right. Yep,
not being able to have kids out the door.
yep.
And, even when I learned about the curve, like that was really helpful to kind of conceptualize,
Mhm.
but it still felt like I was supposed to get kids to a point.
Yep.
And within like the neurodiversity affirming framework, Robert Jason Grant talks about this a lot. That if we think about just neurodiversity,
Mhm.
there will be new curves that come up because of
Exactly.
it is oppression to walk through the world
Mhm.
where your identity,
Mhm.
who you are, diagnoses that you have, your neurodiversity, your disability, your medical condition, whatever it is, isn't understood or honored,
Yeah,
where you're expected to be something else to fit
yeah,
in, right, in some
yeah,
way.
yeah.
And because we know, like, schools aren't built, we just even know that schools aren't built for neurodivergent kiddos. It's not going to be built for kids with FASD.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it is longer term. I talk to families, and so sometimes it scares play therapists. Like, I can't like start with someone who might be in long term. Well, that might be not just with you, right?
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
But there's like when I talk to my supervisees, for example, or new clinicians working with FASD, I say, look at that curve, and I kind of think about it, it's longer and stretched out,
Yeah,
right? And I kind of explain that first with
yeah,
my families to give them that front loading of what counseling is going to be like. And then there's multiple curves that this child may go on. Unfortunately, when I get my kiddos referred to me, or my youths or my adults, it's not usually just because of FASD. Other
Mhm.
stuff's happened.
Mhm.
There may be, if they're adoptees, right? There's attachment trauma. Sometimes there's multiple placements
Mhm.
where, if with biological families, and I want to cut out the stigma of that. That's part of the
Yeah,
stigma as play therapists is that
exactly.
alcohol exposure can happen at any point for many different reasons. We don't need to shame or blame it.
Exactly.
And so we want to create that like we do for anything, where we shame or blame anything that's
Yeah.
coming into the playroom.
Yeah.
And we get to then see that there's multiple layers that going. There might be trauma, right? Fortunately, many of my kiddos, they're also very highly vulnerable.
Mhm.
A lot of my clients have the biggest hearts. They love indiscriminately, which means that judging danger.
Yeah, they exactly. They can put themselves in vulnerable situations.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
FASD, in order to get that diagnosis, is always a memory-based disability.
Mhm.
Long-term memory is usually fantastic,
Mhm.
but short-term memory, actually encoding the memory,
Mhm.
storing it, and retrieving it is actually a part of the disability. So it's where you get yourself into the same situation over and over again. Or where people always say like they're making the same mistake because that's the memory. So that's a trauma, right? Having
Mhm.
things happen over and over and over again, because you may not remember it explicitly, but your body remembers, the nervous system remembers.
Mhm. Totally.
And then you're expected to walk through the world like all of this doesn't matter. That whole all below the surface, and your nervous system, and you're expected, even though you're a kid, right? And developmentally, we know kids need co-regulation. They need support with that. Well, that all that's going on and none of those needs are being met. And you're supposed to just have it put together. And so some kids do at school, and then at home it falls apart. But there's actually something going on in the nervous system below the surface that requires that longer term
Yeah.
focus and therapy.
Yeah.
So we know about like the vagus nerve polyvagal theory. There's also an adjacent system to that,
Mhm.
right? Called the hypothalamus pituitary
Yeah.
adrenal axis, the
Yes.
HPA axis,
Yes, exactly.
right? Where the polyvagal like theory and vagus nerve, like it's our nervous system. HPA axis is the neuroendocrine system. It's all the hormones, the cortisol, adrenaline.
Yes.
We know specifically that prenatal alcohol exposure greatly impacts that system,
Mhm.
so that it doesn't turn on.
Mhm.
Right? For a lot of people, that system will turn on space and time.
Mhm.
It just doesn't turn on. It has to be turned on with co-regulation
Mhm.
or deep, like physical activity, something that makes you sweat. So for a lot of kiddos, well, screaming, hitting, crying, throwing stuff for 20 minutes.
It's an attempt to regulate.
It's an attempt to regulate, it's an attempt to turn on the
Yes.
HPA axis.
Uh-huh.
So if you think about, well, if that's just going on, like in the physiology, how long will you need to have support to teach you about that, to unshame that, to teach people around you, to develop strategies? So longer term.
Yeah. So I want to round out this
Yeah.
conversation with parents.
Mhm.
And I love that you've already said, I think probably one of the most important things, which is um I could imagine a parent bringing their child in with an FASD diagnosis and the play therapist having a judgment directly on the parent. So thank you for just naming that parents don't deserve or need to be judged in in that situation. Things happen,
Mhm.
and they're here getting support for their child and for themselves. And we also know that sometimes children come into parents' lives in other ways too, already with an FASD diagnosis, and there wasn't a biological connection right between them. Let's just talk for a couple minutes about parents, and then I want to tell our listeners where they can learn more about you and your institute.
There is an incredible amount of stigma, and
Mm.
it's hard with FASD because the mechanism is in the diagnosis. It's the only condition, right, where
Yeah.
we have that. And whenever I talk about FASD, I always start off like my presentations with destigmatizing prenatal alcohol exposure.
Yeah.
It happens
Mhm.
so much more than we talk about, right?
Yeah.
Alcohol consumption in most places in the world
Mhm.
is promoted even,
Mhm.
right? And most people don't know they're pregnant. Most pregnancies are unplanned.
Mhm.
Uh, and at any point,
Mhm.
exposure can happen and FASD can happen, right? We kind of think it's certain populations. We found from our studies that FASD happens in every single, at the same rate within every socioeconomic status, every ethnicity, every ancestry, every community, but it doesn't get diagnosed the same.
Right.
And so, because we suddenly stigmatize women and women drinking, or
Mhm.
women, if prenatal exposure has happened, we stigmatize those kids.
Mhm.
And even if we're working with biological families, with adoptive families, with caregivers, there
Mhm.
shouldn't be any difference of treatment, really,
Mhm.
in any circumstance. There should never be any bias or discrimination.
Mhm.
But that is the reality of every single caregiver, that they are being judged and shamed
Yeah.
in every other system. And they have heard statistics and outcomes, and they're being told, if you don't do this, this is what I heard, then this is what's going to happen to your child. Things that feel inevitable, feel hopeless. And so that's
Mhm.
what's walking into the playroom.
Mhm.
I know that I spent years parenting from a complete fear response.
Mhm.
And so working with parents is empowering them,
Mhm.
is helping them feel not judged and blamed and
Mhm.
shamed, because they're, if people just look at the top of the iceberg, it's also in there that it's the parents not doing their job, not putting enough discipline, not doing enough here,
Yeah.
versus looking below the surface. And being able to have conversations with FASD. If
Mhm.
this podcast can help you with anything, is that talk about it.
Yeah.
Talk about it with the caregivers, talk about it with kids. I have had families who are like, don't talk about the diagnosis. I want to keep it a secret.
Mhm.
What is that? Like, just think about
Mhm.
energetically, what does that do?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so that's why when I started the FASD Institute, and I
Mhm.
co-founded that with my husband, and we created, my husband's Squamish Nation. So we wanted to think about decolonizing the work that we do, doing it through neurodiversity, affirming lens, created what we couldn't find for my daughter.
Mhm.
And because literally in BC, can people think like BC has all this like knowledge about FASD, is where we used to have the international conference. There were 3 people I knew who worked within mental health and FASD.
Mhm.
One was my supervisor,
Mhm.
one of them was my colleague, and I was the only play therapist.
Mhm.
And we wanted to create, and the people told me, don't call it the FASD Institute. Don't call it that, right?
Mhm.
You're going to create. I'm like, why not? Why should I be ashamed or have stigma?
Right.
I can't say that. And that's what I do. How can I
Yeah.
work with clients
Yeah.
where that's their diagnosis?
Right.
I'm just stigmatizing them right even before they meet me.
Mhm. Mhm.
We wouldn't want anyone, any child, any client that we work with to feel ashamed about any parts of themselves.
Mhm.
So start destigmatizing. That's something you can do as a play therapist.
Yeah.
Start destigmatizing FASD.
So huge. Natasha, I really can't thank you enough. And listeners, I hope you took lots of notes, and I hope you'll go back and listen to this again. And if you didn't catch the first episode, go listen to us having a conversation in the hallway.
Yes.
All right. So, website, where can
Yes.
people find you? Where can they learn more?
FASDinstitute.com, nice and easy.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And email, probably easiest one is admin@fasdinstitute.com. And I realized I don't know if people heard it. I had a siren go by. So you might have heard in the first podcast, people walking by, but now you just heard a siren.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious.
Yes.
Um, okay, well, perfect. And you know, listeners, if you want more education,
Mhm.
I know Natascha also
Mhm.
educates and
Yes.
workshops and presents. And so
Yes.
if you are part of an organization, you want Natascha to come and
Mhm.
educate your organization on FASD, you have a school. You want Natascha to come educate your school on FASD, whatever it is. Just know that she's available to be able to do that. So,
Yes.
Natascha, once again, thank you so much. And listeners, I say this every time, and I mean it wholeheartedly every time. Whatever's happening in your life, wherever you are, whatever you're up to, tune into yourself, listen to yourself, take care of yourself, honor yourself. Let's go one step further from today. Honor your sensory needs.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Honor what's unique about you. Honor the way your own body works, the way your brain works, the way you move through the world, the way you
Mm.
talk, the way you just honor, right? Honor what is uniquely true for who you are as a human
Mhm.
being on the planet. And you're the most important toy in the playroom, and all parts of you deserve to be seen and acknowledged and loved just like the kiddos. So until next time, everyone.